Next question, the 1955 renewed order for Holy Week. Okay, absolutely. That is the Pius XII Holy Week, and that was promulgated in 1955 and became obligatory for Holy Week 1956. And there are some who do not offer it, some priests, good priests, because they feel, they don't say that it was evil, but they make an argument that there were modernists involved, and that Bonini specifically, and that he had his own intentions. Well, first of all, everything the popes did in the past, they have many people working under them, and they're not always good people, because not everybody is a saint, and some of them might have had their own intentions, but that doesn't change the fact of the Holy Ghost watching over the church, and the Pope is infallible in the liturgy. So what Pius XII did was his decision, and it's infallibly good, and there were good reasons for it. Even if there were modernists that had their own intentions, that would not affect that. Secondly, it's simply not true that Bonini was the mastermind of this Holy Week. It's not even true that he had much anything to do with it. Nor is it true that this was started specifically by Pius XII. So the real one working on this, we have the published minutes of the meetings. We've had them for about 20 years, so I don't know why there's still this rumor that Bonini is behind it. Bonini was the secretary of the commission Pius XII founded, but if you read the minutes of the meetings, of which we can read all of them, Bonini almost never says anything. All he did, it was Cardinal Antonelli. He directed all the meetings, he worked on all the documents, the suggestions, and what Bonini, one thing he did is, one document, he proofread it and made what Cardinal Antonelli calls some editorial changes. So it was not his at all, but Bonini, who was a modernist, who was responsible for the Novus Ordo, so-called Mass, he lied and took credit for it years later. But it's not him, it's not his name on it. And now that for 20 years we've had the documents from the archives, we know it was not him, it was Antonelli. And Antonelli was a very conscientious cardinal, and he was not appointed by Pius XII. Some say, oh, Pius XII made bad choices of people. Well, Antonelli was Pius XI's choice. In 1930, he appointed him to a new section, the historical section of the Sacred Congregation of Rites, which later is what led to Pius XII's commission. So it was Pius XI that started this in 1930, and he personally appointed Antonelli, and Antonelli was trained in the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology that Pius XI had founded. So he was the product of Pius XI, and as he worked on this for 2 decades, under Pius XI and Pius XII, it came to fruition in 1955. And it was only in Vatican II that Bonini, in the 1960s, that Bonini was doing all his work. And Antonelli opposed what Bonini was doing in the 1960s. And I'll read you here something, a very interesting thing from Antonelli's diary, which we've also had this for 20 years. Father Annibale Bonini has been appointed secretary of the new Congregation for Divine Worship. I could say many things about this man. I have to add that he always had the backing of Paul VI. While I would like to be mistaken, I can say that his greatest lacuna was his lack of any theological training or sensibility. This was a grave defect and lacuna, because in the liturgy every word and every gesture expresses a theological idea. I have the impression that much has been conceded to the Protestant mentality, especially in matters regarding the sacraments. It is not that Father Bonini created these ideas. No, that is not the case. He used the services of many people, and I do not know why he admitted into this work so many people, so many able people of a liberal theological outlook. He either did not notice, or else he just did not oppose certain tendencies as he ought to have. Now you can see he tries to excuse Bonini because Cardinal Antonelli was a very humble, charitable man. He liked to judge the best of people when he could, but I think Bonini truly was the modernist that he was. So there's more could be said, but I think that's enough to get that point across. How do we get a pope today? And does he have to be recognized by the Novus Ordo Catholics in quote there, quotation marks, who are in good faith? It's a good question. It's something I had intended to address from the talk, so I will just read a short part from Cardinal Journet's work on Christ the Incarnate Word, in which he speaks of what do you do if you don't have cardinals to elect a pope. In case where the settled conditions of validity have become inapplicable, the task of determining new ones falls to the Church by devolution, this last word being taken as Cajetan notes, not in the strict sense. Devolution is strictly to the higher authority in case of default in the lower, but in the wide sense, signifying all transmission even to an inferior. On this point, Cajetan's thought is as follows. During a vacancy of the apostolic see, neither the Church nor the Council can contravene the provisions already laid down to determine the valid mode of election. However, in case of permission, for example, if the Pope has provided nothing against it, or in case of ambiguity, for example, if it is unknown who the true cardinals are, or who the true Pope is, as was the case at the time of the Great Schism, the power of applying the papacy to such and such a person devolves on the universal Church, the Church of God. When the provisions of the canon law cannot be fulfilled, the right to elect will belong to certain members of the Church of Rome. In default of the Roman clergy, the right will belong to the Church Universal, of which the Pope is to be bishop. The Church has the right to elect the Pope, and therefore the right to certain knowledge as to who is elected, as long as any doubt remains and the tacit consent of the universal Church has not yet remedied the possible flaws in the election. There is no Pope. A doubtful Pope is no Pope. So, specific answer, how do we get a Pope today? As all theologians agree, if there are cardinals, nobody else but cardinals have the power to elect. There's the thesis clergy say that these cardinals, they're not true cardinals, they admit that, but they still say the Novus Ordo cardinals, quote-unquote cardinals, that aren't cardinals, have the power to elect a pope. I disagree with that, and we disagree with that, for many reasons that I don't have time to detail now, but for one thing, they admit they're not cardinals. And so if you say the election must be done by cardinals, but they're not cardinals, that's a problem. And also, as Capello says, an election by laymen cannot confer the papal power. It can only designate a person, but it does not give a right to receiving the papal power. Therefore, those who elect must be the clergy. So, in any case, the originator of the thesis, Bishop Gerard de Laurier, he was a brilliant theologian. He himself did not believe that a material pope could make new cardinals. So he said that he only believed that John Paul II's election was valid because there were 10 cardinals left still living from the time of Pius XII who participated in that election. So obviously, once those cardinals were dead, he didn't believe a so-called material pope could make new cardinals. But those who hold the thesis today, they do believe that. And it's a completely new teaching. And it's not something that Bishop Gerard de Laurier used. So who then, if we don't have cardinals? Most theologians agree, based on very good theological principles, that it devolves to whoever is next most likely or responsible for that duty of the care of the church. So some say the clergy of Rome, some say it would be all the bishops. And there's debate, well, would that include bishops that aren't ordinaries of dioceses? Well, I think if you don't have clergy in Rome and you don't have bishops of dioceses and you don't have cardinals, the principle would still apply. The next logical one to do an election would be the Catholic bishops, who are in fact caring for the faithful. That is our bishops. However, some will say, well, that's conclavism. You just say you make a bunch of bishops and you vote, and that's you can't do that, they say. Well, if you don't admit any of the other ones, you have to, on principle, admit that that is possible. The only reason everyone's reluctant to say that is because we haven't absolutely ruled out every conceivable possibility. And that's too much to explain, but the point is, I say that it is not against principles to say that the traditional bishops could elect a pope, but it would have to be with agreement all through the church. Otherwise, you have the same situation in the Great Western Schism, where there were 2 popes for years, 2 claimants. They tried to settle it where the majority of cardinals, I believe it was a majority from both sides, actually got together and they had an election in Pisa. You'd think, well, that would solve it because it was a majority of cardinals from both sides. Well, because it wasn't everybody, it only succeeded in creating one more doubtful pope, because not everybody recognized it. So we cannot do an election unless everybody's in agreement. And we're not at that point right now. But as far as, who would have to accept it, I would say it'd have to be, all the clergy would have to accept it. And if it's not, then you can't have any certainty that the election was valid. And it's not a matter of jurisdiction to elect a pope, because as everyone admits, electing a pope is not an act of jurisdiction. St. Robert Bellarmine specifically says this, because nobody gives jurisdiction to the pope. God does. Christ gave it to Peter and his successors.